Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me and for inviting a Frenchman under those circumstances. I'll try to be as focused as possible, and I'll try not to be normative. That is to say, I'm not going to make policy recommendations. I would like to try to address one issue, which I think is also an issue with which this Commission is concerned, i.e., how did we get there? How did we get from those radical Islamic militants who fought jihad against the Red Army in Afghanistan in the 80s and who were at the time backed both by the USA and by petro-monarchies, if you wish, to 9/11. And I think we can try to understand how the phenomenon progressed from one to the other, and how, and pardon my French if I may say so, but how in a way jihadi chicken came home to roost. As you know, when the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan in late December 1979, this had been a terrible year for American interests in the area. Ayatollah Khomeini had seized power in Iran as of February 1st. In early fall, the Grand Mosque in Mecca, then still under the control of a traditional friend of the United States, the Saudi dynasty, had been besieged and freed only after a heavy battle, and also American hostages had been taken in your embassy in Tehran. So on the one hand, you had a revolutionary understanding of Islam, the Iranian one, which was claiming to use the religion of Islam as a means to fight against the West. And on the other hand, you had the Soviet army, which had gone down towards the hot seas or the warm seas following Lord Curzon's Great Game scheme. So for some reasons, then this challenge to the United States was not fought via the force of arms. 79, as you know, was 5 years or 4 years after the end of the Vietnam War. And the war against the Soviet Union was waged by proxy, was waged vicariously, thanks to those militants, those Islamist radical militants, who suddenly became freedom fighters. I mean, they were called to jihad, that is to say, to fight against the infidels that had encroached on the land of Islam by those very same clerics that my colleague Steve Emerson mentioned earlier on, Sheikh Qardawi and a few others who at the time saw that their interests and the interests of the United States coincided. And so not only from inside Afghanistan, but also from Algeria, Egypt, the Philippines, even the inner cities or the suburbs of some European countries with Muslim immigrant populations, then you had a sort of international brigades, international Islamist brigades that went to Afghanistan. Then the issue was to kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, to inflict a Vietnam, if I may say so, on the Soviet army, on the Red Army, and on the other hand, to lit a sort of counter-fire against the Iranian Revolution and to press this sort of claim about political Islam in a way which would not be anti-American, but rather anti-communist, anti-atheist, if you wish. By 1989, both of those objectives were to a large extent met. On the 15th of February 1989, the Red Army pulled out of Afghanistan, admitting its defeat, though the regime, the pro-Soviet regime in Afghanistan would only crumble 3 years later. And in the same year, 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini died after he had signed a truce with Saddam Hussein, who at the time was the darling of the West, of the US, of France, of course, and of the petro-monarchies, because he had resisted the expansion of Iran to the West, thanks to the war, the sort of attrition war, or the war of the trenches that took 8 years between Iran and Iraq. So then in 1989, to a large extent, when we think of that war, this is a war that had almost no cost, because from conservative estimates, and it is difficult to know, but I'm sure that in your capacity as a commission you will have those figures and you will make them public. Generally speaking, academics like myself, who have no access to real information, consider that the cost of jihad in Afghanistan was approximately $1.2 billion a year. Half of it was being paid by the oil countries. That is, say, $600 million for the American taxpayer, if I may use an American colloquial expression. It's peanuts for getting rid of the Soviet Union, and plus the fact that no Americans were killed there. I mean, the ones who fought against the USSR were those bearded guys who at the time were called freedom fighters. They had no mothers, or their mothers wouldn't demonstrate or picket down there in the mall, and they would have no visas anyway. And this was perceived as an operation which was that almost costed nothing. Well, then there was a problem, because as of 1989, most people believed that there was no hurry or no reason to give any retribution to those groups. That if one stopped paying the jihadists who had been there for 8 years, and 5 years at times in the caves in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, they would evaporate, they would disappear, they would go back to their countries of origin and disappear. And conversely, many people thought that there was no need to compensate the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein for the human price it had paid for the West, to a large extent, in the war, and for the oil monarchies in the war it led against Khomeini's Iran between 1980 and 1988. So that led to a tremendous misunderstanding, to use a euphemism, between the former allies, i.e. the US forces and the US administration, and those freedom fighters, AK jihadists. And in spite of evaporating, those people who knew nothing else but waging war began to turn against the ones who had fed them and to bite the hands that had given them food and shelter. That took place particularly after the crucial turning point that was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990, when, as the Saudi regime called the US to the rescue on the 7th of August, then Saudi Arabia, in the eyes of those militants, got the same status as Afghanistan, if you wish. It was there again a part of the land of Islam that was invaded by infidel armies. Hence, jihad against America became legitimate. Not all of the religious establishment that had backed the jihad against Soviet-occupied Afghanistan backed the jihad against American, quote-unquote, occupied Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, some did. And that led to a rift within the Islamist movements between the radicals, who then would engage against Saudi Arabia, against America, and the so-called moderates, who would be taken into politics of co-optation by the regimes, like the Muslim Brothers in Egypt and so on and so forth. So, anyway, that led to a situation where the most radical, the most violent elements in the movement suddenly became apolitical. I mean, they would they would believe that violence in itself was not only a means but an aim. And in doing so, they sought to have a remake or to ape what had been jihad in Afghanistan that was successful because it ousted the Soviets. That developed into two different moments along the 1990s. From 1992 to 1996 approximately, they tried to develop guerrilla movements mimicking the Afghan one in Algeria, in Bosnia, in Egypt, later in Kashmir, in Chechnya. And to a large extent, those movements failed. They did not manage to seize power because ultimately they were unable to draw a large constituency to back them. And then, in the second half of the 1990s, then those groups who were closely knit and who traced back to the Afghanistan period, the training camps and the network which was created there. As you know, the term Al-Qaeda in Arabic means base, but it means database, Qaidat al-Ma'lumat, because it was the Bin Laden and his likes had put all jihadists on a database, on a computer database, so that, you know, they could know where they were after they left the camps, right? And so they turned to another tactics, which was terrorism. And by terrorism, as opposed to guerrilla, I mean action which did not need the backing of the masses, but action which would be done in closed groups, very spectacular, with the media as a sort of a loudspeaker. And that was intended to change the mentality of those masses and to mobilize them, to show that the enemy was weak and that through violence they could achieve their aims. Now, to conclude, at first, action was directed essentially against Saudi-American relations. Most of the bombings took place in relation to that. The 1996 bombings against American servicemen in Dhahran in June or July 1996 in eastern Saudi Arabia. Then the bombing of the two embassies on the 7th of August 1996, and 7th of August is the anniversary of the call by the Saudis to the American troops on the 7th of August 1990, which is the main symbolic date for them. Then the USS Cole in October 2000, and all that did not lead to any change in the US-Saudi relationship, in the US ruling family and Saudi Arabia relationship. And then, in my view, this is how we led to, we got to a sort of a further step, an escalation in this logic of terrorism, which led to 9/11. 9/11 also has to be put into context because, in my view, it is something that uses a language which is already, if you wish, in use at the time. 9/11 comes approximately a year after the beginning of the Second Intifada. During the Second Intifada, you have those kids who have become heroes and martyrs, quote unquote, in some parts of the youth in the Muslim world, who blow themselves up in pizzerias in Tel Aviv and where have you. But there again, the retaliation of the Israeli army is such that whatever those terrorists do against the Israelis, nevertheless, militarily, the Israelis keep the upper hand. And the 9/11 bombing, to some extent, is a continuity both of the previous bombings of the Bin Laden group, I mean, around Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth, and it blends that with if you wish, the gesture of the terrorism activities in Palestine and Israel against the Israelis, to show that they are able to overcome their military weakness, that they can fight the superpower, and in doing so, they had hoped to mobilize the masses throughout the Muslim world in order to show that they could topple America. This, I think, was a failure. And as far as we can judge, as of now, they have not been able to do so. And what that led to was the toppling of the only significantly pro-terrorist regime in the Muslim world, that is to say Afghanistan, the Taliban regime was downed, then the Saddam Hussein regime disappeared. And in my view, and I was asked to read the final part of a written piece in my statement, so I'll abide to that. So the political cost of such campaigns of suicide bombings and terrorism seems, in my view, to be considerable and its gains questionable. There is only the exaltation of a small minority who have locked themselves into a mentality where terrorism becomes an end in itself.